Hello and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. It is the evening of April 14th, 1865, Good Friday, and the President of the United States sits in a theatre box watching a comedy he has no desire to see. Below him, the stage lights cast strange shadows. The play is Our American Cousin, a popular farce that the President's wife insisted they attend. He's exhausted, bone-tired in a way that sleep cannot cure. The war is over. Lee surrendered just 5 days ago at Appomattox Courthouse. The nation that nearly tore itself apart is whole again, though wounded in ways no one yet understands. In the President's box, decorated with American flags for the occasion, Abraham Lincoln leans back in his rocking chair. His wife Mary sits beside him, radiant in her happiness. For once, he seems to have let his guard down. Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris complete the party. The President holds Mary's hand, a rare public gesture of affection from a man who keeps his feelings locked away. On the stage below, an actress delivers a line meant to provoke laughter. It works. The audience roars. In that moment, when the theatre erupts in noise, a man enters the presidential box. He is an actor named John Wilkes Booth, 26 years old, handsome, consumed by hatred for everything this president represents. He knows the play by heart. He knows precisely when the laughter will be loudest. He carries a single-shot Derringer pistol and a knife. The president never turns. The shot, when it comes, is muffled by the laughter. A small caliber round enters the back of Abraham Lincoln's skull, travels diagonally through his brain, and lodges behind his right eye. Lincoln's arm jerks upward. Mary's screams are lost in the chaos. Booth leaps to the stage, catches his spur on a flag, breaks his leg, and still manages to shout, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, before limping into the night. The president slumps forward. Blood begins to seep from the wound. He is unconscious before Rathbone can reach him. He will never wake again. They carry him across the street to a boarding house, to a room too small for his 6'4" frame. They lay him diagonally across a bed meant for shorter men. Doctors arrive. They probe the wound. There is nothing to be done. For 9 hours, Abraham Lincoln, the man who held the nation together through 4 years of unimaginable bloodshed, who freed 4 million enslaved people with the stroke of a pen, who redefined what America could mean, lies dying in a rented room while rain drums against the windows, and a nation begins to understand what it is about to lose. At 7:22, on the morning of April the 15th, 1865, in a cramped bedroom that smells of blood and tobacco smoke, surrounded by cabinet members, generals, and his eldest son weeping uncontrollably, Abraham Lincoln dies. Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War who so often clashed with the president, who thought him too lenient, too forgiving, too merciful, looks at the still face on the pillow and says, "Now he belongs to the ages." Consider the strangeness of what I have just described. The most powerful man in America, the victor in the bloodiest war in the nation's history, the president who saved the Union, killed while watching a comedy, shot from behind by an actor who believed himself a hero, dead at the moment of his greatest triumph, 5 days after winning a war that nearly destroyed him. What series of events creates such a man? What shapes a person capable of leading a nation through its darkest hour? How does a boy born in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky, a child with less than a year of formal schooling, become the man who redefined American democracy? That is the question we will answer tonight. But before we begin this journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It is a simple and wonderful way to support this work, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and now settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us travel back nearly 2 centuries to a wilderness at the edge of American civilization, to a world of dense forests and hard labour, of scattered cabins and endless work, to a place where a child's survival was never guaranteed and education was a luxury few could afford. Tonight we will follow Abraham Lincoln from the Kentucky backwoods where his story began, through the crushing poverty of the Indiana frontier, across the prairies of Illinois where he built himself into a lawyer and politician, through the agonizing years of civil war that tested every principle he held, and finally to that theatre box where his story ends. It is a tale of loss and perseverance, of self-education and profound loneliness, of a man who learned to use words as weapons and wielded them to preserve a nation. Lincoln lived 56 years, and in that time he experienced more failure than most people face in a lifetime. He lost elections, lost businesses, lost his mother, lost 3 of his 4 sons. He battled depression so severe that friends worried he might take his own life. Yet somehow from this foundation of sorrow and disappointment, he built the moral clarity to abolish slavery and the political skill to hold the country together when every force pulled it apart. How did he do it? How did a man with so little formal learning develop such mastery of language? How did someone who lost more elections than he won become perhaps the greatest president in American history? How did a person who knew profound personal grief find the strength to shoulder a nation's suffering? That is what we will discover tonight. But before Abraham Lincoln became a legend, he was simply a baby crying in a one-room cabin in the Kentucky wilderness, born into a family that owned nothing but their willingness to work. The story begins not in triumph, but in dirt and darkness, in a place so remote that news of the outside world arrived weeks late, if it arrived at all. The land that would become Kentucky in the early 1800s was a contested space, a violent borderland between the United States and the native nations who had lived there for centuries. It was a place of dense forests where trees grew so close together that sunlight barely reached the ground, of streams and creeks that could become raging torrents in spring, of rich soil that promised prosperity to anyone strong enough to clear it. The wilderness was dangerous. Panthers screamed in the night. Wolves hunted in packs. Settlers built their cabins in clusters for protection, though many families still lived isolated days from their nearest neighbour. The land grants were chaotic, overlapping claims that would spawn lawsuits for decades. Slavery existed here, though Kentucky was not the Deep South. Some families owned enslaved people. Others, like the Lincolns, did not, either from moral conviction or simple poverty. Into this rough country came Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, a man of moderate height and considerable strength. Thomas had been born in Virginia in 1778 to a family of modest means. His own father, also named Abraham, had been killed by Shawnee warriors in 1786 while clearing land, shot in the back while his 3 sons watched. Young Thomas had watched his father die, had seen his older brother run for help, had crouched in terror as his middle brother fought off the attackers. The trauma marked him. He grew into a cautious man, hard-working but unlucky, always choosing land with questionable titles, always moving before roots could take hold. Thomas Lincoln could read but barely, could write his own name but little more. He was a carpenter by trade, skilled with wood, capable of building a cabin or a coffin with equal competence. In 1806 he married Nancy Hanks, a woman about whom history records frustratingly little. She was born in Virginia, possibly illegitimate, raised by relatives. She could not write and possibly could not read. She was, by all accounts, kind, gentle, and deeply religious. She sang hymns while she worked and taught her children Bible verses before they could write their names. On February 12th, 1809, In a one-room log cabin on Sinking Spring Farm near Hodgenville, Kentucky, Nancy Lincoln gave birth to her second child. They named him Abraham, after his grandfather who had died under Shawnee arrows. The cabin where Abraham Lincoln entered the world measured roughly 16 by 18 feet. One room with a dirt floor, a stone fireplace at one end, a single door, one window covered with greased paper to let in light. The walls were chinked with mud to keep out the wind. The furniture consisted of a bed, a table, a few stools, and little else. This was standard frontier housing, neither better nor worse than thousands of other cabins scattered across Kentucky. But it was a hard place to be born, a harder place to survive. Abraham had an older sister, Sarah, born 2 years earlier. She would become his closest companion, the person who taught him his letters, who looked after him when their mother was busy with the endless work that frontier life demanded. As a baby, Abraham was unremarkable, long and thin, with dark hair and grey eyes that would deepen to hazel as he aged. He cried like any infant, needed milk and warmth, knew nothing of the world beyond the cabin walls. His mother held him, sang to him, and returned to work as quickly as frontier women had to. The farm at Sinking Spring was not successful. The title was clouded, as so many were. Thomas Lincoln, who had already moved several times, found himself in court fighting over the ownership of land he had paid for but could not prove he owned. In 1811, when Abraham was 2, the family moved 10 miles northeast to a larger farm on Knob Creek. Here they would stay for 5 years, the longest period of stability in Abraham's childhood. The Knob Creek farm sat in a valley between steep hills. A creek ran through the property, clear water that could rise suddenly during storms. The cabin was similar to the one at Sinking Spring, a single room, a dirt floor, a constant battle against cold in winter and heat in summer. But there was more land here, 30 acres, and Thomas Lincoln planted corn and tried to make a life. This is where Abraham's conscious memory begins. He would later recall being sent to fetch water from the creek, a distance that seemed enormous to his child's legs. He remembered planting pumpkin seeds in the corn rows, carefully spacing them as his father showed him, only to have a rainstorm wash them all away. He cried at the loss, not understanding that such setbacks were simply the rhythm of farming life. He remembered his sister Sarah leading him by the hand to a crude schoolhouse, a subscription school where parents who could spare a few coins sent their children for brief periods when farm work allowed. The teacher was Zachariah Riney, a Catholic, unusual in largely Protestant Kentucky, who taught the children their letters using the Bible as the primary text. Abraham attended this school for a few weeks, perhaps a few months. He learned the alphabet, learned to form letters on a wooden board with charcoal. Then planting season came and school ended, or harvest season came and school ended. The education of frontier children was always interrupted, always secondary to survival. The boy was old enough now to have chores. He carried water, gathered firewood, helped his sister with smaller tasks. He watched his father work, trying to absorb the skills he would need. But even as a child, Abraham Lincoln showed a peculiar resistance to physical labour. He would do what was required, but he took no satisfaction in it. What he loved was stories. When travelling preachers came through, which they did occasionally, holding revivals in clearings or at crossroads, young Abraham would sit transfixed. The preachers used vivid language, painted pictures with words, told Bible stories with dramatic flair. The boy absorbed not just the content but the technique, how a pause could build anticipation, how repetition could drive a point home, how a story well told could make people forget their troubles for an hour. He began to mimic them. He would gather other children and retell the sermons he'd heard, standing on a stump, gesturing, modulating his voice. The other children laughed, but they also listened. There was something compelling about the way this strange, tall, ungainly boy could hold attention. His mother encouraged this. Nancy Lincoln, who had so little herself, recognised something in her son, some hunger for knowledge that went beyond the practical skills needed for farming. She taught him Bible verses, told him stories from Scripture, instilled in him a moral framework that would shape his entire life. She did this while spinning thread, while cooking, while doing the 1,000 tasks that frontier women performed to keep their families alive. But Kentucky was not working for Thomas Lincoln. The land title disputes continued. Slavery, which Thomas opposed, was spreading. In 1816, when Abraham was 7, Thomas made a decision that would reshape his son's life. They would move to Indiana, to territory where slavery was prohibited, where land titles were supposedly more secure. The family packed everything they owned onto a wagon and headed north. They crossed the Ohio River into free territory, then plunged into wilderness even denser than Kentucky. The Indiana they entered was barely settled, a land of thick forest that blocked out the sun, of bottomless mud in spring, of isolation so complete that weeks could pass without seeing another human being outside the family. Thomas Lincoln found a site in Spencer County, near a tiny settlement that would eventually be called Gentryville. He claimed 160 acres and began the brutal work of clearing land. For the first weeks, the family lived in a 3-sided shelter, essentially a shed open to the weather on one side. Thomas worked from dawn to dark, cutting trees, burning stumps, clearing land for planting. Abraham, now 7, was expected to help, which meant hauling wood, piling brush, endless, exhausting work for a child. The winter of 1816 to 1817 was particularly harsh. The family huddled in their inadequate shelter, burning wood constantly, never quite warm, eating corn mush and wild game when Thomas could shoot it, going hungry when he could not. By spring, Thomas had built a proper cabin, another one-room structure but more substantial than the temporary shelter. They had survived the first year, which many families did not. Sarah and Abraham, the 2 children, had grown thin but remained healthy. Nancy Lincoln had aged visibly, the constant work and poor diet taking their toll. Then more family arrived. Thomas's cousin Dennis Hanks, a teenager, came to live with them. The cabin grew more crowded, but there was also more labour to share the work, and Dennis became an older brother figure to Abraham, teaching him to hunt, to track animals, to survive in the woods. In 1818, when Abraham was 9, catastrophe struck. A disease called milk sickness swept through the settlement. It was a mysterious illness that killed dozens of people that autumn, though no one understood its cause. We know now that it came from cows eating white snake root, a toxic plant, and passing the poison into their milk. But in 1818, it seemed like a curse from God. Nancy Lincoln fell ill in late September. She developed the characteristic symptoms, tremors, vomiting, severe abdominal pain. She took to her bed in the cabin. For a week, she suffered while Thomas and the children watched helplessly. There was no doctor, no medicine, nothing to do but wait. On October 5th, 1818, Nancy Lincoln died. She was 34 years old. Thomas built her coffin himself, using his carpenter's skills to craft a simple box of green pine. They buried her on a hill overlooking the cabin, less than a quarter-mile from where she had died. Abraham and Sarah stood at the grave while their father read from the Bible. There was no preacher available. Nancy Lincoln went into the ground with no formal service, no marker but a wooden board with her name carved roughly into it. For Abraham, 9 years old, this was the first great loss of his life, but it would not be the last. His mother had been the gentle presence in a hard world, the person who sang hymns and told stories, who taught him that there was more to life than work and survival. Now she was gone, and the cabin seemed darker, colder. emptier than before. The year after Nancy's death was the grimmest of Abraham's childhood. Thomas Lincoln, overwhelmed by grief and the demands of the farm, struggled to maintain the household. Sarah, now 11, did her best to take over the cooking and cleaning, tasks she was barely old enough to manage. Abraham retreated into himself, a tall, awkward boy who spoke little and seemed to be growing in strange proportions, all legs and arms with enormous hands and feet. He helped with the farm work because he had to, but his heart was not in it. He was already beginning to understand that he did not want the life his father lived. The endless cycle of clearing land, planting crops, barely surviving. But what alternative existed for a frontier boy with no education and no prospects? That question would haunt him for years. Then, in December 1819, something remarkable happened. Thomas Lincoln travelled back to Kentucky and returned with a new wife. Her name was Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children of her own. She brought furniture, household goods, and something the Lincoln cabin had lacked since Nancy's death: order and warmth. Sarah Bush Lincoln, who had become known to the children as their stepmother, but whom they would love as deeply as any mother, transformed the Lincoln household. She cleaned the cabin thoroughly, organised the children, and insisted that Abraham and Sarah be educated. She had books, a treasure almost beyond imagining in that place: a Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, and a few others. She told Thomas that the children must attend school when possible. For Abraham Lincoln, this was the turning point. His stepmother saw something in him that his father did not, or could not. She recognized that this strange, quiet boy with his hunger for words was not meant for a life behind a plough. She encouraged his reading, gave him access to her books, did not mock him when he spent hours lying on his stomach in front of the fire reading by firelight because the cabin had no lamp. Thomas Lincoln did not approve. He saw his son's reading as laziness, as a way to avoid work. There were constant conflicts. Thomas would assign Abraham a task, clearing brush or splitting rails, and would return hours later to find the boy sitting against a tree with a book, the work barely started. Neighbours remembered Thomas sometimes striking Abraham for this, trying to beat the books out of him. It did not work. Abraham would take the punishment, then return to reading at the first opportunity. He attended school in irregular bursts, a few weeks here, a few months there, whenever farm work permitted, and whenever a teacher was available in the area. He had several teachers in Indiana: Andrew Crawford, who taught in 1820, James Swaney in 1822, Azel Dorsey in 1824. Each school session lasted only as long as the subscription held out, as long as enough parents could pay the small fee required. Abraham learned arithmetic, though he struggled with it. He learned grammar and improved his writing. But his real education came from the books. He read everything he could find or borrow. He walked miles to borrow a book from a neighbour, then read it multiple times until he'd memorised large passages. He had almost no paper, so he practised his letters on boards with charcoal, on the back of a wooden shovel, on any surface that would hold a mark. When he encountered a new word, he would use it in conversation, often incorrectly, adjusting his understanding through trial and error. He developed a peculiar habit that would stay with him all his life. When he read something, he would then retell it in his own words, out loud, pacing back and forth, working through the logic until he fully understood it. His stepmother would hear him in the cabin late at night, talking to himself, explaining concepts to an invisible audience. It disturbed his father, but Sarah Bush Lincoln encouraged it. She understood, even if she could not articulate it, that her stepson was teaching himself to think. The books Abraham encountered shaped his worldview in profound ways. Aesop's Fables taught him that wisdom could be conveyed through simple stories. The Bible gave him a moral framework and exposed him to the rhythms of King James prose. Robinson Crusoe showed him that a person could survive and even thrive through ingenuity and persistence. Pilgrim's Progress emphasized the importance of moral struggle, and a book he borrowed called The Life of Washington by Mason Locke Weems introduced him to the idea that individuals could shape history. The Washington biography was pure hagiography, full of invented anecdotes like the cherry tree story, but it planted something in young Abraham's mind. The idea that a person, through character and will, could rise from ordinary circumstances to accomplish extraordinary things. It was a dangerous idea for a frontier boy to entertain, but once planted, it grew. By the time Abraham turned 15 in 1824, he stood 6 feet tall, still growing, gangly and awkward but with enormous strength. He could wield an axe all day, could lift weights that other men struggled with, could split rails faster than experienced farm hands. But his heart was not in manual labour. He would work when required, but he read whenever possible. He wrote when he had materials. He told stories and made people laugh with his gift for mimicry and his growing collection of jokes and anecdotes. He was odd. That was clear to everyone in the community. He did not fit the pattern of frontier masculinity. He did not hunt for pleasure, did not drink, did not fight unless provoked, and even then, reluctantly despite his size and strength. He was known for being kind to animals, for treating slaves he encountered with a respect unusual in that time and place. Once, seeing another boy torment a turtle, Abraham intervened and delivered an impromptu lecture on cruelty that left the other boy ashamed. This was not typical frontier behaviour, but Abraham was also developing skills that would serve him later. He was learning to argue, to construct logical cases, to use words precisely. When disputes arose in the community, people began asking Abraham to write letters for them, to draft simple legal documents. He had no training, but his self-taught literacy was better than most in the area. He charged nothing for these services, but he absorbed the experience. He was learning how language could settle disputes, how the right words could clarify confusion, how written agreements could prevent conflicts. These lessons would prove invaluable. In 1828, when Abraham was 19, he had his first journey beyond the narrow world of Spencer County, Indiana. A neighbour named James Gentry hired Abraham to help his son Alan take a flatboat loaded with produce down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. For Abraham, who had never been more than a few dozen miles from home, this was an overwhelming experience. The journey took 3 months. They poled the flatboat down the Mississippi, passing through territories Abraham had only read about, seeing cities and towns and populations unlike anything in backwoods Indiana. But the experience that marked him most profoundly came in New Orleans itself. For the first time, Abraham Lincoln witnessed slavery on a large scale. He saw human beings sold like livestock in the public markets. He saw families separated, children torn from mothers, men and women inspected like horses, their teeth checked, their muscles examined, while buyers bargained over prices. He saw the slave pens, the chains, the casual brutality of a system that treated people as property. Indiana had been free territory, and while slavery existed in Kentucky, Abraham had been too young to fully comprehend what he saw. But in New Orleans, at 19, with his mind sharpened by years of reading and thinking, he understood completely. He said very little about it at the time. Alan Gentry remembered only that Abraham seemed disturbed, quieter than usual after visiting the slave markets. But the experience planted something that would grow over decades, a moral revulsion against slavery that would eventually reshape the nation. The 2 young men sold their cargo and their flatboat in New Orleans, then returned to Indiana via steamboat, a journey that would have been impossible a generation earlier. Abraham came home with $25, more money than he had ever possessed, all of which he gave to his father, as was expected. He was still a minor, not yet 21, and his labour belonged to his father until he came of age. But the journey had changed him. He had seen that the world was larger than Spencer County, that possibilities existed beyond farming, that he wanted something different from the life his father had lived. What that something was, he could not yet articulate, but the hunger for it was growing. In 1830, when Abraham was 21, Thomas Lincoln made another decision to move. Milk sickness had returned to Indiana, and Thomas had heard that Illinois offered better land. More importantly, Abraham was now of age, legally free to leave, and Thomas wanted to keep the family together for at least one more move. In March 1830, the Lincoln family again packed everything they owned onto wagons and moved west. They settled in Macon County, Illinois, near the Sangamon River. Thomas claimed land and began once more the work of clearing forest and building a cabin. Abraham helped, as he always had, because despite everything, he loved his father in his way and felt the obligations of family. He split rails for fences, thousands of rails that winter and spring. He helped build the cabin. He worked the first planting. But when winter came, the winter of 1830 to 1831, one of the worst in Illinois history, Abraham made a decision. The snow that winter was measured in feet, not inches. Supplies ran low, the family nearly starved, and when spring finally came, when the snow melted and the Sangamon River flooded and then receded, Abraham Lincoln, now 22 years old, told his father he was leaving. He would help the family move one more time, to Coles County, where Thomas had decided the land was better. He would assist with the relocation, would see them settled, and then he was done. He would make his own way, find his own life, become something other than a farmer in a one-room cabin. Thomas accepted this. What choice did he have? Abraham was a man now, legally and practically. If he wanted to leave, he could leave. On July 4th, 1831, Abraham Lincoln arrived in New Salem, Illinois, a tiny settlement of about 25 families on the Sangamon River. He had $30 in his pocket, earned from working odd jobs during the move. His worldly possessions amounted to a few pieces of clothing and the books he had managed to acquire. He was 22 years old, 6 feet 4 inches tall, rail-thin, awkward, with rough frontier manners and an accent that marked him as backwoods. He had less than 1 year of formal schooling scattered across his childhood. He had no profession, no prospects, and no clear plan for the future. What he did have was an almost desperate hunger to improve himself, a gift for language that he had spent years developing, and a moral seriousness that set him apart from most young men his age. He also had something else, though he did not yet know it. He had the raw materials for greatness. But before that could emerge, he would need to spend years in the wilderness, years of failure and disappointment and crushing setbacks that would have destroyed a lesser person. The boy from the backwoods was about to become a man, but the path would be longer and harder than anything he had yet experienced. The next decade of Abraham Lincoln's life, from his arrival in New Salem in 1831 to his election to the Illinois state legislature in 1834, was a period of almost constant struggle. He was trying to become something he could not yet define, to reach a station in life that seemed impossibly distant, to transform himself from a frontier labourer into an educated, respectable member of society. The obstacles were enormous, and the setbacks were frequent. New Salem was hardly a town, a collection of rough cabins scattered along the Sangamon River. It served as a trading post for the surrounding farms. When Lincoln arrived, he needed work immediately. He found it helping Denton Offut run a general store. The work was not demanding, measuring out flour and sugar, selling tools and cloth, chatting with customers. What mattered was that it gave Lincoln something he had never had before: time. Behind the counter of that store, during the long hours when customers were scarce, Abraham Lincoln educated himself. He borrowed every book he could find in New Salem and the surrounding area. He read law books, mathematics texts, grammar books, histories, anything that would expand his knowledge. When he encountered concepts he did not understand, he worked through them slowly, pacing the length of the store, talking to himself, repeating the material in his own words until comprehension came. The townspeople thought him odd. They would see him lying on his back in the shade, feet propped against a tree, reading while he was supposed to be working. They saw him at night in his rented room, reading by firelight. He was different from the other young men in New Salem, most of whom spent their leisure time drinking and fighting and chasing women. Lincoln did none of these things. He didn't drink alcohol. He avoided physical confrontations despite his size and strength, and he was painfully shy around women. But he was making friends. New Salem, for all its roughness, had a few men who valued learning. They formed a debating society, and Lincoln joined eagerly. Here he could practice the skills he'd been developing, arguing points of logic, constructing cases, learning to think on his feet. He was terrible at first, nervous and stammering, but he improved with practice. He was also developing a reputation for honesty that would follow him throughout his life. When he made mistakes in giving change at the store, which he did occasionally, he would walk miles to return a few cents to a customer. Once, realizing he had charged a woman 6 cents too much, he closed the store and walked several miles to her cabin to return the coins. People began calling him Honest Abe, a nickname he did not particularly like but could not shake. In 1832, when Lincoln was 23, 2 events occurred that would shape his future. The first was the Black Hawk War. Chief Black Hawk of the Sauk Nation led a group of Native Americans back across the Mississippi River into Illinois, attempting to reclaim land that had been taken from them through a treaty Black Hawk considered fraudulent. Illinois called for militia volunteers. Lincoln, seeing an opportunity for adventure and a small payment, enlisted. His company elected him captain, an honor he later said meant more to him than any he would receive later. But Lincoln's military service was more comedy than glory. His company never saw combat. They marched around the Illinois countryside, occasionally found evidence of Native American presence, but never encountered actual warriors. Once, an elderly Native American wandered into their camp carrying a safe passage letter from a U.S. general. Some of Lincoln's men wanted to kill him anyway. Lincoln stepped between them and the old man, risking a fight with his own troops to protect a defenseless person. His men backed down. The incident showed Lincoln's moral courage, his willingness to do the right thing even when it was unpopular. But militarily, the Black Hawk War was meaningless for Lincoln. He later joked that his most dangerous battles were against mosquitoes, and that he shed more blood to those insects than he ever did to enemy warriors. The second event of 1832 was Lincoln's first attempt at politics. Encouraged by friends who thought his speaking ability and personal popularity made him a viable candidate, Lincoln ran for the Illinois House of Representatives. He was 23, unknown outside New Salem, with no money and no political experience. His campaign platform, such as it was, focused on improving navigation on the Sangamon River and on internal improvements, roads and canals that would help farmers get their crops to market. He gave a few speeches, shook hands, and hoped for the best. He lost badly, finishing 8th in a field of 13 candidates. In New Salem, he won 277 of 300 votes, evidence of his local popularity. But the district was large, and outside New Salem, no one knew who he was. The defeat stung, but it was not crushing. Lincoln had larger problems. Denton Offutt's store failed, a common occurrence in that era of economic instability. Lincoln was unemployed. He and a partner, William Berry, decided to open their own store, buying the business on credit. This was a disaster. Berry turned out to be a drunk who stole from the till to buy alcohol. The store's location was poor. Customers were scarce. In 1833, the store failed completely, leaving Lincoln with debts that would take him 17 years to repay. He later called it his national debt, treating the obligation as sacred even when no one would have blamed him for walking away. Now he was 24, unemployed, in debt, and with no clear path forward. He took whatever work he could find, splitting rails, harvesting crops, any manual labour that paid. But he also got lucky. He was appointed postmaster of New Salem, a position that paid almost nothing but had one enormous advantage. As postmaster, Lincoln could read all the newspapers that came through the mail before delivering them. In that era, newspapers were the primary source of information about politics, law, and the wider world. Lincoln absorbed them, reading every paper that passed through his hands, learning about politics at the state and national level, developing opinions on the issues of the day. He also became a surveyor, teaching himself the mathematics and techniques required, borrowing instruments, and taking on jobs measuring property lines. The work was irregular but paid better than common labour, and it took him all over the county, introducing him to people, building a network that would prove useful. But underneath these jobs, Lincoln was engaged in a more serious project. He was studying law. There were no law schools in Illinois, no formal requirements for becoming a lawyer. If you could pass the bar examination and convince a judge that you understood the law, you could practice. So Lincoln borrowed law books, Blackstone's commentaries, Chitty's pleadings, other standard texts. He read them the same way he had read everything else, slowly, carefully, talking to himself, pacing, working through each principle until he understood it completely. People remembered seeing him lying under a tree reading a law book, so absorbed that he did not notice when spoken to. Others recalled him walking the roads near New Salem, book in hand, stopping occasionally to shout an argument to the empty air, working out some legal principle. It looked like madness, but it was education. By 1834, Lincoln was ready to try politics again. He ran for the state legislature a second time, now better known, with a wider network of supporters. He won, finishing second in a field of 4, securing one of Sangamon County's 4 seats in the State House of Representatives. He was 25 years old, $1,000 in debt, with 1 suit of clothes and a limited education. But he was a legislator, a man of some standing, and he was on his way. Before he could take his seat, he needed proper clothes. He borrowed $200 from a friend to buy his first suit, a dark outfit that made him look almost respectable despite his height and rough manners. In December 1834, Abraham Lincoln travelled to Vandalia, then the state capital, and took his seat in the Illinois House of Representatives. The legislature was a rough and tumble place, full of frontier politicians who drank heavily and argued louder. Lincoln fit in but also stood out. He was quieter than most, more thoughtful, willing to listen before speaking. But when he did speak, people noticed. His logic was clear, his arguments well constructed, and he had a gift for storytelling that made even dry legislative matters interesting. He aligned himself with the Whig Party, which supported internal improvements and protective tariffs, policies that Lincoln believed would help develop Illinois. He worked on committees, drafted bills, and began learning the mechanics of politics. He also continued studying law. In 1836, he passed the bar examination and was licensed to practice law in Illinois. He was 27 years old and had finally found a profession. In 1837, he moved to Springfield, the new state capital, and formed a law partnership with John Todd Stewart, a well-established attorney who had encouraged Lincoln's legal studies. Lincoln arrived in Springfield with everything he owned in his saddlebags. He had no money for lodgings. A shopkeeper named Joshua Speed, observing Lincoln's dejection, offered to let him share the room above his store. Lincoln carried his bags upstairs, came back down and said, "Well, Speed, I'm moved." It was the beginning of one of the most important friendships of his life. Speed would become Lincoln's closest friend, the person he confided in, trusted completely, turned to in moments of personal crisis. Springfield in 1837 was a growing town of about 1,500 people, rough around the edges but with ambitions to be a real city. Lincoln established himself as a lawyer, taking cases in the circuit courts that travelled around Illinois. This meant weeks at a time on horseback, riding from county seat to county seat, sleeping in rough taverns, trying cases before juries of farmers and tradesmen. The work was grueling, but Lincoln loved it. He was good at it. His ability to connect with common people, to explain complex legal principles in simple language, to tell stories that made juries laugh or think or feel sympathy, these skills made him successful. He was not the most learned lawyer, his legal education was too haphazard for that, but he was effective. He also continued his political career, winning re-election to the legislature in 1836, 1838, and 1840. He became one of the Whig Party's leaders in Illinois, known for his skill in debate and his ability to craft legislation. But his personal life was a shambles. He was awkward around women, painfully shy, unsure of himself in social situations that had nothing to do with law or politics. In 1835 he had met a young woman named Anne Rutledge in New Salem. Whether they were romantically involved is unclear, the evidence is ambiguous, but she died of typhoid fever in August 1835, and Lincoln fell into a depression so severe that friends worried he might harm himself. He would have more such episodes, periods of profound melancholy that could last for weeks, during which he could barely function. Friends learned to watch him during these times to keep him company, to make sure he did not have access to weapons. He called it the hypo, short for hypochondria, the 19th century term for depression. It was a burden he would carry his entire life. In 1840, Lincoln met Mary Todd, a woman from a prominent Kentucky family who had come to Springfield to live with her sister. Mary was well educated, spoke French, came from wealth and social position, everything Lincoln lacked. She was also willful, temperamental, intelligent, and ambitious. She saw potential in the gangly lawyer from nowhere. They began a troubled courtship. Lincoln was hesitant, unsure of himself, plagued by doubts about marriage. Mary was insistent. They became engaged in 1840. Then Lincoln broke off the engagement in 1841, plunging into one of his worst depressive episodes. For months, he could barely function, missing legislative sessions, unable to work. Friends, especially Joshua Speed, kept watch over him. Slowly he recovered. He and Mary reconciled in 1842. On November 4th, 1842, they married in a small ceremony at Mary's sister's house. When asked that morning where he was going, Lincoln reportedly replied, "To hell, I suppose." It was a joke, but it reflected his deep ambivalence about marriage. The marriage was complicated from the start. Mary had a temper and Lincoln had his depressions. They argued frequently, but they also shared genuine affection. Mary believed in Lincoln's potential when he did not believe in himself. She pushed him toward greater ambition, encouraged him to aim higher, and Lincoln, for all his ambivalence, was devoted to her in his way. They would have 4 sons, though only one would survive to adulthood. Robert Todd Lincoln, born in 1843, would live into the 20th century. Edward Baker Lincoln, born in 1846, died in 1850 at age 3, plunging both parents into grief. William Wallace Lincoln, born in 1850, would die in the White House in 1862 at age 11. Thomas Tad Lincoln, born in 1853, would die in 1871 at age 18, 6 years after his father's assassination. Loss for Lincoln was a constant companion. In 1846, Lincoln was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, his first national office. He was 37 years old. He and Mary and baby Robert moved to Washington, D.C., a city that overwhelmed Lincoln with its size and sophistication. He served one term, 1847 to 1849, and accomplished little of note. He opposed the Mexican-American War, calling it unjust and unconstitutional, a position that made him unpopular in Illinois. He introduced a bill to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, though it went nowhere. Mostly, he watched and learned and felt inadequate among men who seemed more polished, better educated, more comfortable in the corridors of power. When his term ended, he did not seek re-election. He returned to Springfield in 1849, thinking his political career was over. He was 40 years old, a moderately successful lawyer with a failed political resume and a difficult marriage. He settled into what he thought would be the rest of his life, practicing law, raising his children, making a living. For the next 5 years, from 1849 to 1854, Abraham Lincoln focused on his law practice. He became one of Illinois' most prominent attorneys, handling cases ranging from property disputes to murder trials, from railroad litigation to patent law. He rode the circuit, travelling from county to county, sleeping in rural inns, eating bad food, working long hours. But the work itself was satisfying. He was good at it, respected for it, paid reasonably well for it. He could provide for his family, educate his son Robert, maintain a comfortable home in Springfield. If he had stayed on this path, history would remember him as a successful frontier lawyer, nothing more. But in 1854, everything changed. Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a law that allowed settlers in new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. This overturned the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had restricted slavery's expansion. The author of the act was Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, a man Lincoln knew well, a brilliant politician who believed that the slavery question should be left to local democracy. Lincoln believed this was morally wrong. Slavery, he thought, was an evil that the founders had merely tolerated in the original states, because eliminating it immediately was impossible. But the founders had also, Lincoln believed, put slavery on the path to ultimate extinction by prohibiting its expansion into new territories. The Kansas-Nebraska Act reversed that policy, opened slavery to potential expansion into areas where it had been prohibited, and in Lincoln's view, betrayed the fundamental American commitment to human equality. This belief drew Lincoln back into politics. In 1854, at age 45, he began speaking against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. His arguments were not based on immediate abolition, which he thought unconstitutional and impractical. Instead, he argued that slavery must be restricted to where it already existed, prevented from spreading, and allowed to die a natural death over time, perhaps over many decades. He believed this was what the founders had intended and what morality required. His speeches were powerful. He combined moral arguments about human equality with constitutional arguments about federal power, with practical arguments about free labor. He quoted the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. He insisted this meant all men, not just white men. Slavery, he argued, violated the core American principle. These were not new arguments. Abolitionists had been making them for decades, but Lincoln made them in a way that appealed to moderate voters, to people who disliked slavery but feared the social disruption of immediate abolition. In 1856, Lincoln joined the new Republican Party, which opposed slavery's expansion. He quickly became one of its leaders in Illinois. He ran for the Senate in 1858 against Stephen Douglas. The race became famous for a series of 7 debates held across Illinois, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where the two men argued about slavery, democracy, and the future of the nation. Lincoln lost the election. State legislatures chose senators in that era, and Democrats controlled the Illinois legislature. But the debates made Lincoln a national figure. His arguments were reprinted in newspapers across the country. He was invited to speak in other states. People began to see him as a potential presidential candidate. In May 1860, the Republican Party met in Chicago to nominate its presidential candidate. Lincoln was not the favorite. William Seward of New York was better known, more experienced, expected to win easily. But Lincoln's managers worked behind the scenes, making deals, building coalitions, convincing delegates that Lincoln was more electable than Seward. On the third ballot, Lincoln won the nomination. He was 51 years old, a former one-term congressman with no executive experience, from a state that had only been in the Union for 42 years. 4 months later, in November 1860, Lincoln was elected President of the United States. He won with only 40% of the popular vote, carrying the North but not appearing on the ballot in most southern states. His election triggered the greatest crisis in American history. Southern states, convinced that Lincoln intended to destroy slavery in Southern society, began to secede. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, 7 states had left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. 4 more would follow. The nation was fracturing, and the responsibility for holding it together fell to a man who had spent most of his life losing elections, burying children, and battling his own despair. The question now was whether Abraham Lincoln, the frontier lawyer who had taught himself everything he knew, was equal to the task. The answer would unfold over the next 4 years in the bloodiest war America had ever known. To understand the man who would navigate the Civil War, we must first understand the man himself, the daily habits and peculiarities that shaped Abraham Lincoln's character. By the time he became president in 1861, Lincoln was 52 years old, and his appearance was striking in its oddness. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall in an era when the average man was perhaps 5 feet 7 or 8. He weighed about 180 pounds, making him rail thin for his height, all sharp angles and long limbs. His face was deeply lined, weathered by years of riding the circuit in all kinds of weather, by stress and sorrow. His eyes were grey, deep-set, capable of expressing profound sadness or sudden warmth. His nose was large and prominent. His ears stuck out noticeably from his head. His hair was coarse, dark, and impossible to control, standing up in odd directions no matter how much he tried to tame it. When he smiled, which he did frequently despite his sadness, his entire face transformed. The lines deepened, the eyes crinkled, and the melancholy fell away, revealing genuine warmth. His voice was higher pitched than one would expect from such a tall man, somewhat shrill when raised, but clear and carrying well, useful for addressing crowds in the days before amplification. He had a backwoods accent that polished Easterners found crude, dropping his G's, using ain't and other colloquialisms that revealed his origins. Lincoln's daily routine in Springfield before the presidency followed a pattern that revealed much about his character. He rose early, around 6, sometimes earlier if he'd been unable to sleep, which happened frequently. He dressed in his rumpled suit. He cared nothing for fashion, and Mary despaired of his appearance, often going to court with wrinkled clothes and boots that had not been polished in weeks. His shirts were frequently too small for his long arms, leaving his wrists exposed. His pants rode high on his legs, showing his ankles. He looked, as one contemporary put it, like he'd been assembled from parts meant for different people. Yet there was a dignity in his carriage, a seriousness in his demeanour that made people overlook his odd appearance once he began to speak. He ate a sparse breakfast, usually just a cup of coffee and perhaps an egg. He ate little throughout his life, indifferent to food in a way that bordered on ascetic. He could sit through elaborate dinners, which Mary sometimes hosted for social and political purposes, and consume almost nothing, picking at his plate absently while engaging in conversation. Sometimes he forgot meals entirely when absorbed in work, going an entire day on nothing but coffee, emerging from his office at night hollow-eyed and famished, surprised to learn that he had missed both lunch and dinner. At the office, he worked on cases with an intensity that impressed his law partners. He would read, write briefs, consult with clients, often working by candlelight or lamplight when natural light faded. His handwriting was clear and legible, each letter carefully formed, reflecting the care with which he approached language. His legal arguments were logical and well organised, building step by step toward conclusions that seemed inevitable once he had laid the groundwork. He prepared meticulously for court, anticipating counter-arguments, planning responses, though he could also improvise brilliantly when surprised. When court was in session, he attended, trying cases with a style that combined folksy storytelling with sharp legal reasoning. Juries liked him immediately. He did not talk down to them. He did not use legal jargon when plain English would suffice. He explained complex matters in simple terms, using analogies drawn from farming, from carpentry, from everyday life that his rural juries understood instinctively. And he made them laugh, deploying his enormous collection of jokes and anecdotes at strategic moments to ease tension, to make a point memorable, to humanize his clients. During breaks, he held court in the courthouse corridors, telling jokes and stories, entertaining other lawyers, building the relationships that made frontier legal practice work. These relationships mattered. Lawyers who rode the circuit together became friends, formed networks of mutual assistance, recommended clients to each other, shared news and gossip. Lincoln was popular among his peers, known for fairness, for honesty, for never taking advantage even when he could have. In the evenings, if he was home and not riding the circuit, he returned to his house on the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets, a 2-story frame house that still stands in Springfield. The house was comfortable but not luxurious, filled with the noise and chaos that 4 boys created, though never all 4 at once due to the deaths. Lincoln was an indulgent father, perhaps too indulgent. He let his sons run wild, did not discipline them, allowed them to interrupt his work, tolerated behaviour that shocked visitors. Mary managed the household and Lincoln let her. He did not involve himself in domestic decisions, did not care about furniture or decorations or social obligations. After dinner, Lincoln would often return to his office to work or read. When he stayed home, he read newspapers, of which he consumed enormous quantities, or books. He loved Shakespeare, could recite long passages from Macbeth and Hamlet, often did so at odd moments. He loved poetry, particularly sad poetry. He memorized poems about death and loss, recited them to friends, seemed to find comfort in articulating sorrow. He also had a bawdy side that shocked some people. He collected jokes and stories, many of them crude by Victorian standards, and would tell them with perfect timing, building to punchlines, laughing at his own jokes. He used humour as a weapon to deflate pomposity, to make points that might offend if stated directly, to cope with stress and sadness. During his bouts of depression, which came irregularly but intensely, Lincoln's routine collapsed. He would stay home, unable to work, sitting in silence or lying in bed for hours. Friends recognized the signs and kept watch. These episodes could last days or weeks, then gradually lift, allowing him to return to work as if nothing had happened. He never spoke of them publicly, treated them as shameful, but they were a constant threat lurking in his psyche. Lincoln had few close friends, but treasured the ones he had. Joshua Speed in particular remained his confidant even after Speed moved to Kentucky. They corresponded regularly, sharing thoughts on marriage, politics, slavery. When Lincoln doubted himself, Speed encouraged him. When Speed faced his own crisis of confidence about marriage, Lincoln returned the favour. Lincoln's relationship with his father remained distant. After moving to Springfield, he rarely visited Thomas Lincoln, did not invite him to his wedding, did not bring his family to meet their grandfather. When Thomas Lincoln was dying in 1851, he sent word asking Abraham to visit. Lincoln did not go, sent a letter instead saying he was too busy, though evidence suggests otherwise. When Thomas died, Lincoln did not attend the funeral, did not mark his grave. The reasons for this estrangement are unclear, but they suggest deep unresolved wounds from childhood. Lincoln's habits of mind were as distinctive as his physical appearance. He thought slowly, methodically, working through problems from first principles. He was not quick-witted in the moment, not good at impromptu remarks, but given time to think, to work out the logic, he was formidable. He read newspapers obsessively, tracking political developments, understanding how public opinion was shifting. In an age before polls, this made him unusually attuned to what people thought. He wrote carefully, drafting letters and speeches multiple times, choosing words precisely. His writing style was clear, direct, without unnecessary ornamentation. He avoided flowery language, pretentious vocabulary. He aimed for clarity above all. His famous speeches, the Gettysburg Address, the second inaugural, achieved their power through simplicity, through choosing the exactly right words and arranging them in exactly the right order. He had a gift for metaphor and analogy, explaining complex ideas through simple comparisons. He thought visually, translated abstractions into concrete images. This made his arguments accessible to people without formal education, while still respecting their intelligence. He was also capable of profound stubbornness. Once he decided something was right, he would not change his mind no matter the pressure. This stubbornness would serve him well during the Civil War when others wavered or lost faith. But it also created conflicts, made him difficult to work with at times, frustrated people who thought he should compromise. Lincoln's religious beliefs were complicated and largely private. He never joined a church, never made a public profession of faith. He was raised in a Baptist environment, knew the Bible thoroughly, quoted it frequently. But he also read skeptical philosophers, questioned traditional Christianity, was rumoured to be an infidel in his younger years. As he aged, especially after the deaths of his sons, his religious language became more pronounced. He spoke of God's will, of divine purpose, though in terms that were often unorthodox. He seemed to believe in a God who was working through history towards some purpose, but he was not sure what that purpose was, or whether humans could understand it. This uncertainty would shape his understanding of the Civil War. As president, Lincoln's daily routine changed, but his essential character did not. He rose early, around 7, and met with his private secretaries John Nicolay and John Hay, young men who managed his schedule and correspondence. He spent hours reading telegrams from the War Department, tracking military operations, agonizing over casualty lists. He met with generals, cabinet members, office seekers, ordinary citizens who somehow gained access to the White House. He held public receptions where anyone could shake his hand, literally anyone, a security nightmare that terrified his guards, but which Lincoln insisted on. He believed the president should be accessible to the people. He ate lunch at his desk, usually something simple, often forgetting to eat at all. Mary tried to get him to take better care of himself, but he ignored health concerns, working through illness and exhaustion. In the evenings, he often walked to the War Department to read the latest telegrams, unable to wait for them to be delivered. He slept poorly, woke frequently, sometimes walked the White House halls at night, his slippers shuffling on the floors, disturbing guards who grew accustomed to seeing the president wandering in his nightshirt at 3 a.m., unable to quiet his mind. This was the man who would guide the nation through its greatest crisis. Odd, awkward, melancholic, brilliant, stubborn, empathetic, shaped by loss and failure, armed with a gift for language and an unyielding belief in human equality. The Civil War that Abraham Lincoln inherited in 1861 was not one he wanted or sought. His goal was to prevent slavery's expansion, not to end it immediately, and certainly not to destroy the Union in the process. But Southern states seceded anyway, convinced that even limiting slavery's spread was an unacceptable threat to their society. By the time Lincoln took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, the Confederate States of America already existed, with Jefferson Davis as its president and Montgomery, Alabama as its capital. In his first inaugural address, delivered to a hostile crowd in a city filled with Southern sympathizers, Lincoln tried to reassure the South, while also making clear he would not allow the Union to dissolve. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, stated he had no constitutional authority to do so. But he also insisted that the Union was perpetual, that no state could leave it, and that he would use the power of his office to hold, occupy, and possess federal property in Confederate states. It was a careful balance, trying to avoid war while not surrendering the principle of union. The balance lasted 5 weeks. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, a federal installation that Lincoln had tried to resupply. The fort surrendered after 34 hours of bombardment. War had begun. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. 4 more southern states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, seceded in response, unwilling to participate in making war on their neighbors. The Union now faced a rebellion of 11 states, controlling an area the size of Western Europe, with a population of 9 million, including nearly 4 million enslaved people. Lincoln had almost no military experience. That brief, uneventful stint in the Black Hawk War 30 years earlier. He had to learn strategy, logistics, military organization on the job. He read books on military tactics, spent hours studying maps, taught himself to understand battlefield reports. He also had to find generals who could actually fight. His first general-in-chief was Winfield Scott, a hero of the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War, now 75 years old and so obese he could not mount a horse. Scott proposed the Anaconda Plan, a slow strangulation of the Confederacy through blockade and control of the Mississippi River. It was sound strategy, but too slow for Northern public opinion, which demanded immediate action. In July 1861, Union forces marched on Richmond, the new Confederate capital, and were routed at Bull Run. The Northern troops, many of them 90-day volunteers who thought war would be a brief adventure, fled back to Washington in panic. The battle shattered illusions. This would not be a quick war. Lincoln replaced Scott with George McClellan, a young, energetic general who had shown competence in Western Virginia. McClellan had organizational genius. He transformed a mob into an army, the Army of the Potomac, drilling them, equipping them, building their morale. But he would not fight. Month after month he delayed, finding reasons not to engage the enemy. He overestimated Confederate strength, demanded more men, more supplies, more time. Lincoln grew frustrated. He wrote to McClellan, "If you don't want to use the army, I should like to borrow it for a while." It was the beginning of a pattern that would torture Lincoln for years, finding generals who could organize but not fight, or who could fight but not organize, or who could do neither. While struggling with military leadership, Lincoln also faced political chaos. His cabinet was filled with men who thought themselves superior to him. William Seward, the Secretary of State, initially tried to run foreign policy without consulting the President. Salmon Chase, the Treasury Secretary, constantly schemed to replace Lincoln as the Republican nominee in 1864. Edwin Stanton, the War Secretary, was brilliant but abrasive, frequently clashed with Lincoln but eventually became one of his most loyal supporters. Lincoln managed these egos with patience and political skill, keeping the government functioning despite constant internal conflicts. The slavery question haunted everything. Lincoln personally hated slavery, called it a monstrous injustice, but he also believed he had no constitutional authority to abolish it in states where it existed. His oath was to preserve the Constitution, which protected slavery in those states. But as the war dragged on, as casualties mounted, as it became clear that the Confederacy was using enslaved labor to support its war effort, Lincoln's thinking evolved. In August 1861, Congress passed the first Confiscation Act, allowing seizure of property, including enslaved people, used to support the rebellion. Lincoln signed it, though he worried about its constitutionality. The next year, Congress passed a stronger version. Gradually, the war was becoming a war against slavery, though Lincoln did not yet say so publicly. In his personal life, the war years brought new suffering. In February 1862, his son Willie died of typhoid fever at age 11. Willie was Lincoln's favourite son, bright and gentle, the child who most resembled him in temperament. His death devastated both Lincoln and Mary. Lincoln wept openly, something Victorian men rarely did. Mary descended into grief so profound that she could not function for months, stayed in her room, barely ate, terrified her remaining sons Robert and Tad. Lincoln had to govern a nation at war while grieving his child. Friends worried he would collapse under the combined weight. But he continued, working through his sorrow, finding in the war's larger tragedy some context for his personal loss. If thousands of fathers were losing sons in battle, who was he to claim his grief was special? In the summer of 1862, Lincoln decided the time had come to strike at slavery directly. He drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, an executive order that would free all enslaved people in states still in rebellion. He presented it to his cabinet in July. Seward suggested waiting for a Union military victory, arguing that issuing it amid defeats would look like desperation. Lincoln agreed. He waited. In September 1862, Union forces stopped a Confederate invasion at Antietam, Maryland. It was hardly a victory, more of a stalemate, but it was enough. On September 22nd, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, giving Confederate states until January 1st, 1863, to return to the Union or face having their enslaved populations declared free. The Confederacy ignored the deadline. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free enslaved people in border states loyal to the Union. It had no legal authority there, but it declared free all persons held as slaves in areas of rebellion. Technically, it freed no one immediately, since the Union did not control those areas, but it transformed the war. Now, Union armies advancing south were armies of liberation. Enslaved people fled to Union lines by the thousands, undermining the Confederate economy and providing the Union with laborers, scouts, and eventually soldiers. More than 180,000 black men would serve in the Union Army and Navy before the war ended, fighting for their own freedom and the freedom of others. The proclamation also ended any possibility that Britain or France would recognize the Confederacy. Those nations had considered it, but they could not now ally with a rebellion explicitly defending slavery against a government that had declared emancipation. Lincoln had turned the war into a moral crusade, betting that the North would accept this transformation, knowing that some would not. The proclamation strengthened Lincoln's resolve, but also made him more hated in some quarters. Northern Democrats called him a tyrant, accused him of violating the Constitution, campaigned against him in the 1862 midterm elections, and made significant gains. Draft riots erupted in New York City in July 1863, the worst civil violence in American history outside the war itself, with mobs murdering black civilians and burning buildings, requiring troops to restore order. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, allowed military arrests of civilians suspected of aiding the rebellion, actions that his critics called dictatorial, but which Lincoln believed necessary to preserve the Union. The war itself ground on month after month, year after year. The casualties were staggering. Single battles like Antietam, Gettysburg, Chickamauga produced casualty lists that numbered in the tens of thousands. The Civil War would ultimately kill about 620,000 Americans, roughly 2% of the nation's population. Proportionally, that would be 6 million deaths today. Every family was touched, every community mourned, and Lincoln bore the weight of every death, every widow's letter, every casualty list. He visited hospitals, walking among the wounded, talking to soldiers, trying to offer comfort. He wrote letters to parents who had lost sons, simple, brief notes expressing sympathy. On November 19th, 1863, Lincoln travelled to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to dedicate a cemetery for soldiers killed in that battle. He was not the main speaker, Edward Everett was, and Everett spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes, 272 words that redefined the war and the nation. He invoked the Declaration of Independence. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth a new nation conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He called the war a test of whether such a nation could endure. He honoured the dead, but insisted that the living must complete their work, that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. It was brilliant, concise, profound. Few people recognized its greatness immediately. Newspapers gave it mixed reviews. But gradually, as the words were reprinted and read, people understood that Lincoln had transformed the war's meaning. It was not just about preserving the Union, it was about creating a more perfect Union, one that truly honoured the proposition that all men are created equal. Finding generals who could win remained Lincoln's greatest frustration. McClellan was finally removed after Antietam for failing to pursue Lee's retreating army. A series of commanders followed. Ambrose Burnside lost badly at Fredericksburg. Joseph Hooker lost at Chancellorsville. George Meade won at Gettysburg but let Lee escape back to Virginia. In the West, Lincoln found better generals. Ulysses S. Grant, quiet, shabby, rumoured to drink, won at Fort Donelson, at Shiloh, at Vicksburg. He was a fighter, willing to take casualties, to press attacks, to grind down the enemy. In March 1864, Lincoln brought Grant east and made him general-in-chief of all Union armies. Grant's strategy was simple, brutal, and effective. He would attack on all fronts simultaneously, giving the Confederacy no rest, using the North's superior numbers to wear down Southern armies. It worked, but the cost was staggering. In May and June 1864, Grant's overland campaign produced 55,000 Union casualties in 6 weeks. Northern newspapers called him a butcher. But unlike previous generals, Grant kept attacking. He drove Lee back toward Richmond, put the Confederate capital under siege, stretched Southern resources to the breaking point. In the West, William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta in September 1864, then marched to the sea, cutting a path of destruction through Georgia, destroying the South's ability to supply its armies. Lincoln faced re-election in November 1864, and for much of the year he thought he would lose. The Democrats nominated George McClellan, who promised peace negotiations with the Confederacy. In August, Lincoln wrote a memo predicting his own defeat, sealed it, and had his cabinet members sign the back without reading it. He planned to cooperate with the new president-elect to save the Union before inauguration, since McClellan's election would likely lead to Confederate independence. Then the military situation changed. Sherman took Atlanta. Philip Sheridan won victories in the Shenandoah Valley. The Union was winning. On November 8, 1864, Lincoln was re-elected with 55% of the popular vote and 212 of 233 electoral votes. He won every northern state except New Jersey, Delaware, and Kentucky. It was a mandate to finish the war on Union terms. On March 4, 1865, Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address, one of the greatest speeches in American history. It was short, just 701 words, and profoundly theological. He pondered why God had allowed the war. Both sides read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, yet one of them must be wrong. Perhaps Lincoln suggested the war was God's punishment on the entire nation for the sin of slavery. If God wills that it continue until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, then we must say, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. But he ended with mercy, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace. Less than 6 weeks later, on April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Other Confederate armies would surrender over the following weeks, but Appomattox effectively ended the war. The Union was preserved, slavery was destroyed, and Abraham Lincoln, at 56, exhausted beyond measure, looked forward to peace. He had 5 days left to live. The last week of Abraham Lincoln's life had the quality of a dream, bright with relief after years of darkness, yet shadowed by a weariness so profound that those close to him worried he might not survive the peace he had fought so hard to secure. On Monday, April 10th, the day after Lee's surrender, Washington erupted in celebration. Crowds gathered at the White House calling for the president. Lincoln appeared at a window, spoke briefly, asked a band to play Dixie. He said it was a lawful tune now since it had been captured. He promised a more formal speech the next day. On Tuesday, April 11th, Lincoln delivered that speech from a White House window to a crowd gathered on the lawn. It was not the speech they wanted. They wanted triumph, celebration, condemnation of traitors. Lincoln instead gave them a careful discussion of Reconstruction policy, how to rebuild the South, how to readmit Confederate states to the Union. He argued for limited black suffrage, suggesting that men who had served in the Union military or who were educated should be allowed to vote. It was a radical position for the time, though modest by later standards. In the crowd listening was John Wilkes Booth, who turned to a companion and said, "That is the last speech he will ever make." On Wednesday, April 12th, Lincoln met with his cabinet. He seemed unusually cheerful, telling stories, laughing more than he had in months. He spoke of his recurring dream, a dream he always had before important events. In the dream, he was on a ship, moving rapidly toward a dark, indefinite shore. He had dreamed it before Antietam, before Gettysburg, before other turning points. He had dreamed it again the night before. Surely, he said, it meant good news was coming. On Thursday, April 13th, Lincoln worked through piles of paperwork, signing pardons for Confederate soldiers, processing requests for clemency. He was generous with pardons, to the frustration of those who wanted harsh punishment for rebels. He argued that enough blood had been shed, that the goal now was reconciliation, not revenge. On Good Friday, April 14th, Lincoln woke early. He had breakfast with his family, a rare event. Mary noticed he seemed more relaxed than he had been in years. The burden that had pressed on him since Inauguration Day in 1861 seemed to have lifted. In the morning, he met with his cabinet and with General Grant, who was in Washington briefly. They discussed Reconstruction, how to treat Confederate leaders, whether to try Jefferson Davis for treason. Lincoln urged mercy. He wanted no executions, no harsh retributions. "Let 'em up easy," he said. Grant left the meeting to catch a train to New Jersey. He and his wife had declined the Lincolns' invitation to attend the theatre that evening. Mary had invited others to fill their box. Most declined. Eventually they found a young couple, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, who agreed to accompany them. The play was Our American Cousin at Ford's Theatre, a comedy Lincoln had no particular interest in seeing. But Mary wanted an outing, wanted to appear in public with her husband in this moment of victory, and Lincoln rarely denied her anything after Willie's death had devastated her. In the late afternoon, Lincoln went for a carriage ride with Mary, just the two of them, a rare moment of privacy. They talked about the future. Mary asked what they should do after his presidency ended. Lincoln spoke of visiting California, of seeing the territories, perhaps of travelling to Europe. He spoke of settling in Springfield, of practicing law again, of living quietly. He said, "We've had a hard time of it since we came to Washington, but the war is over, and with God's blessing, we may hope for 4 years of peace and happiness, and then we will go back to Illinois and pass the rest of our lives in quiet." That evening, they went to Ford's Theatre. The president's box was draped with flags for the occasion. The play was silly, a farce about an American rustic in British high society. Lincoln, who was known to laugh loudly at humour, seemed to be enjoying himself. Mary sat close to him, holding his hand, happy. At 10:15 p.m., during the third act, during a scene that provoked laughter from the audience, John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box. He was an actor, knew the theatre intimately, had planned this for weeks. He had bribed the president's messenger, who was supposed to guard the box, to go get a drink. The box was unprotected. Booth carried a single-shot Derringer pistol and a knife. He aimed the pistol at the back of Lincoln's head from a distance of about 6 feet. He pulled the trigger. The bullet entered Lincoln's skull behind the left ear, travelled diagonally through his brain, and lodged behind his right eye, fracturing the orbital bone. Lincoln's arm jerked upward involuntarily. He slumped forward, then back. He never regained consciousness. Mary screamed. Major Rathbone lunged at Booth. Booth slashed him with the knife, cutting his arm deeply, then leaped from the box to the stage 12 feet below. His spur caught on one of the flag decorations, throwing him off balance. He landed hard, breaking his left leg just above the ankle. Still he stood, shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, the motto of Virginia, and limped off stage into the night. The theatre erupted in chaos. People screamed, surged toward the stage, tried to climb to the president's box. A young army surgeon named Charles Leal reached Lincoln first. He examined the president, found the wound, probed it with his finger. The damage was catastrophic. The brain was destroyed. There was no hope. But Lincoln was still breathing, his heart still beating. They could not leave him in the theatre. 4 soldiers carried him down the stairs and out into the street. Across the street stood a boarding house owned by a tailor named William Peterson. They carried Lincoln there into a back bedroom and laid him diagonally on a bed too short for his 6'4" frame. His feet hung off the end. They removed his coat and shirt, covered him with blankets. Doctors arrived. Mary arrived, hysterical with grief. Robert Lincoln, the eldest son, arrived from the White House. Cabinet members came. Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, took charge, setting up a command post in the boarding house, directing the search for Booth, trying to determine if this was part of a larger conspiracy. It was. That same night, Lewis Powell, a Booth co-conspirator, attacked Secretary of State William Seward in his home, stabbing him repeatedly. Seward survived. George Atzerodt was supposed to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, but lost his nerve and got drunk instead. The conspiracy was falling apart even as it succeeded in its primary goal. In the back bedroom, Abraham Lincoln lay dying. His breathing was laboured, irregular. Blood and brain fluid seeped from the wound onto the pillow. Mary came in periodically, sobbed over him, then was led out when her grief became too much for the others to bear. Robert wept. The doctors monitored the president's vital signs, knowing they could do nothing but wait. Through the night, Lincoln's breathing grew shallower. His pulse weakened. Outside, rain fell on Washington. Crowds gathered in the streets despite the late hour, waiting for news. At dawn, Lincoln's breathing became barely perceptible. At 7:22 on the morning of Saturday, April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln drew his last breath and died. Edwin Stanton looked at the still form on the bed and said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Or possibly he said, "Now he belongs to the angels." Witnesses disagreed on the exact words, but the meaning was clear. The man who had saved the Union and ended slavery was gone. The funeral train that carried Abraham Lincoln's body from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, travelled 1,654 miles over 13 days, stopping in cities along the route so that the nation could say goodbye. In Baltimore, in Philadelphia, in New York, in Albany, in Buffalo, in Cleveland, in Columbus, in Indianapolis, in Chicago, and finally in Springfield, the train stopped. The coffin was removed, lying in state was held, and hundreds of thousands of people filed past to see the dead president. In Philadelphia, 300,000 people viewed the body. In New York City, the number was 500,000. The coffin also contained the body of Willie Lincoln, which had been disinterred from its Washington grave so that father and son could be buried together in Springfield. Mary Lincoln was too distraught to accompany the train. She remained in the White House for weeks, unable to function, while the nation mourned. The funeral train became a river of grief flowing backward through Lincoln's life, retracing his journey from Springfield to Washington, returning him to the prairie where he had built his career, his marriage, his family. The train moved slowly, stopping at small towns where crowds had gathered, sometimes in the middle of the night to watch it pass. People stood in fields holding torches or lanterns, silent as the train rolled by. At every major stop, the rituals were similar. The coffin would be carried to a public building, the State House or a courthouse. It would be placed on a catafalque draped in black bunting. An honor guard would stand watch. Then the doors would open and the people would come. They came in numbers no one had anticipated. They came to see the man who had saved the Union, who had freed the enslaved, who had given his life, as it seemed to them, for the nation. Many who had criticized Lincoln in life now mourned him in death. The assassination transformed him from controversial president to martyred saint. The fact that he died on Good Friday, in the same week that Jesus was crucified, seemed to religious Americans like divine symbolism. Lincoln had died for the nation's sins, had given his life to redeem America from the evil of slavery. The funeral train reached Springfield on May 3rd. Lincoln had not been home in 4 years. The city draped itself in mourning. On May 4th, the funeral was held at Oak Ridge Cemetery, on a hill overlooking the city. Thousands attended. Mary Lincoln was not among them. She remained in Washington, incapacitated by grief. Robert Lincoln was there, devastated and angry, trying to hold himself together for the sake of appearances. Tad Lincoln, only 12, was there, not fully comprehending that his father would not return. The casket was placed in a receiving vault to await construction of a permanent tomb. Willie's casket was placed beside it, father and son together at last. The speeches were long, flowery, full of biblical references and classical allusions. They praised Lincoln's greatness, his wisdom, his martyrdom. They did not capture the man himself, the melancholy, the humour, the stubborn morality, the self-made intellect. Perhaps no words could. John Wilkes Booth was hunted for 12 days before being cornered in a tobacco barn in Virginia. He was shot, either by a soldier or by himself. Witnesses disagreed, and died hours later whispering, "Useless, useless," whether referring to his paralysed hands or to his cause, no one knew. His co-conspirators were caught, tried by military tribunal, and hanged in July 1865. Booth's diary, found on his body, revealed that he had expected to be hailed as a hero for killing Lincoln. Instead, he was reviled even in the South. His act had accomplished nothing except to deprive the defeated Confederacy of the one leader who might have ensured a merciful peace. Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln's death, was a Tennessee Democrat whom Lincoln had chosen as a running mate in 1864 to appeal to border states and loyal Southerners. He lacked Lincoln's political skill, his moral authority, his ability to balance justice and mercy. Reconstruction under Johnson became a disaster, undoing much of what Lincoln had fought to achieve. The freed enslaved people gained legal freedom, but not the economic or political power needed to sustain it. Within a few years, white Southerners had reasserted control through violence and voter suppression. It would take another century and another great moral crusade, the civil rights movement, to complete what Lincoln had started. Mary Todd Lincoln never recovered from her husband's death. She lived another 17 years, growing increasingly unstable, eventually being committed briefly to a psychiatric facility by Robert, who feared for her safety. She died in 1882 at her sister's home in Springfield, forgotten by most, mourned by few. Tad Lincoln, the youngest son, died in 1871 at age 18, possibly of tuberculosis. Robert Lincoln, the only son to reach adulthood, lived until 1926, serving as Secretary of War and as Minister to Great Britain, always carrying the weight of being Lincoln's son, never quite escaping his father's shadow. Now, more than 150 years after his death, Abraham Lincoln remains perhaps the most studied, most written about, most argued over figure in American history. More than 16,000 books have been written about him, more than any other American. His image appears on the penny and the $5 bill. His likeness is carved into Mount Rushmore. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., completed in 1922, has become a sacred space in American civic religion, the site where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963, where Marian Anderson sang in 1939 after being denied access to other venues because of her race, where people go to contemplate the meaning of America. But the real legacy of Abraham Lincoln is not in monuments or currency or books. It is in the transformed nation he left behind. Before Lincoln, The United States was a confederation of states, bound loosely together, with slavery as its foundational evil. After Lincoln, it was a nation, singular not plural, with slavery destroyed and a new birth of freedom, however imperfectly realized, written into its Constitution. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, was passed by Congress in January 1865 while Lincoln lived, though he did not live to see it ratified by the states. The 14th Amendment, guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection under law to all persons born in the United States, followed in 1868. The 15th Amendment, prohibiting racial discrimination in voting, came in 1870. These Reconstruction amendments, born from Lincoln's War and Lincoln's moral vision, reshaped the Constitution and provided the legal foundation for the civil rights movement a century later. Lincoln's words, especially the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural, became touchstones for American democracy. His insistence that all men are created equal, that the Declaration of Independence's promise applied to all people, not just white people, transformed American self-understanding. Before Lincoln, many Americans, even in the North, accepted racial hierarchy as natural. After Lincoln, such beliefs could no longer be held without contradiction to America's founding principles. This did not end racism. America would struggle with that legacy for generations, but it changed the terms of the struggle. His political method, using moral arguments grounded in the Declaration of Independence, combined with patient pragmatism about how to achieve moral ends, became a model for later leaders, not just in America but around the world. Leaders fighting for civil rights, for democracy, for human equality in every corner of the globe have studied Lincoln's speeches, absorbed his techniques, adopted his framework of combining moral urgency with political patience. Martin Luther King Jr. quoted Lincoln constantly, invoked his legacy at every opportunity, stood in his memorial to make his case for racial justice. King understood that Lincoln had redefined America's promise, and that completing Lincoln's work meant making that promise real for all Americans, regardless of race. The March on Washington in 1963, where King delivered his most famous speech, was officially titled the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, deliberately echoing Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation centennial year. King began that speech by invoking Lincoln directly, saying, 50 years ago, a clear echo of Lincoln's 77 years ago from Gettysburg. This was not coincidence. It was the civil rights movement consciously positioning itself as the completion of Lincoln's unfinished work, as the fulfillment of promises made but not kept during Reconstruction. Even international leaders took inspiration from Lincoln's example. Nelson Mandela, fighting apartheid in South Africa, studied Lincoln's ability to hold together a fractured nation, to find common ground with enemies, to pursue reconciliation without abandoning justice. Gandhi, leading India's independence movement, admired Lincoln's combination of moral clarity and political flexibility. Václav Havel, leading Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution, quoted Lincoln's belief in government of the people, by the people, and for the people as a guiding principle for post-communist democracy. Lincoln's personal qualities, his self-education and rise from poverty, his fundamental honesty and integrity, his remarkable sense of humour even in the face of profound tragedy, his extraordinary capacity to grow and change his views when confronted with new evidence or new moral understanding, all these became essential parts of the American mythos of self-made success and democratic leadership. The log cabin to White House narrative is fundamentally Lincoln's narrative, and it has inspired countless generations of Americans, and indeed people around the world, to believe that they too can rise above their circumstances, can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, can achieve great things through persistent effort, strength of character, and unwavering commitment to principle. His failures matter too. He lost more elections than he won. His businesses failed. He suffered profound depression. He struggled in his marriage. 3 of his 4 sons died before adulthood. And yet he persevered, kept working, kept trying, kept believing that progress was possible even when evidence suggested otherwise. For people facing their own failures and losses, Lincoln's life offers proof that failure is not final, that disappointment does not disqualify you from eventual success. The fact that he freed the enslaved is central to his legacy. 4 million people in bondage became free because of decisions Lincoln made, because of a war he led, because of an Emancipation Proclamation he issued despite enormous political pressure to abandon it. The 13th Amendment, which he pushed through Congress, ensured that freedom could not be reversed. This is not a small thing. It is perhaps the most consequential act any American president has ever taken. The largest expansion of human freedom in American history accomplished in a single presidential term. That it was done by a man who grew up in a poor family, who had minimal formal education, who suffered personal tragedies that would have broken most people, makes it all the more remarkable. Lincoln proved that ordinary people, if they develop their minds, strengthen their character, and hold to moral principles, can accomplish extraordinary things. But Lincoln's legacy is complicated by what came after. Reconstruction failed. The freedmen did not receive the land, the education, the political protection they needed to truly be free. White supremacy reasserted itself across the South through terrorism and legal oppression. By 1900, Black Americans in the South had been effectively re-enslaved through systems of sharecropping, convict leasing, and Jim Crow segregation. This was not Lincoln's intention, but it happened nonetheless. It raises hard questions. Was Lincoln's approach to Reconstruction too lenient? Should he have insisted on harsher terms for Confederate states, on guarantees of black political power, on land redistribution? We cannot know what he would have done had he lived. His second inaugural suggests he was moving toward a vision of reconciliation grounded in justice, but he did not live to implement it. Some historians argue that Lincoln's death was the greatest disaster of Reconstruction, that only he had the political skill and moral authority to enforce a just peace. Others argue that no individual, however skilled, could have overcome the racism embedded in American society. Both may be true. Lincoln was capable of great things, but not miracles. As we reflect on Lincoln's life from the vantage point of the 21st century, certain patterns emerge. He was a man of profound contradictions. He believed in racial equality in principle, but harbored racist assumptions in practice. He hated slavery, but was willing to tolerate it where it existed to preserve the Union. He was deeply moral, but also deeply pragmatic, willing to compromise on means if it advanced his ultimate ends. He was profoundly sad, but also possessed a gift for humour. He was self-educated, but more learned than many college graduates. He doubted himself constantly, but also possessed iron determination. He was shaped by loss, childhood poverty, his mother's death, his sister's death, his son's deaths, electoral defeats, military setbacks. Lesser people would have been destroyed by any one of these losses. Lincoln experienced all of them and somehow transmuted suffering into empathy, failure into perseverance, doubt into moral clarity. His greatest quality may have been his capacity for growth. The Lincoln of 1861, who promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed, became the Lincoln of 1863 who issued the Emancipation Proclamation, who by 1865 was pushing for black voting rights. He changed not because he was unprincipled, but because he was thoughtful, willing to reconsider views when confronted with new realities. This capacity for growth, This willingness to admit when you are wrong and chart a new course is rare in any person, and especially rare in a president. In the end, what is Abraham Lincoln's legacy? It is the preserved Union, one nation instead of two or more. It is the destruction of slavery, 4 million people freed. It is the Reconstruction Amendments that made equality a constitutional principle, even when practice lagged far behind. It is the Gettysburg Address and its redefinition of America as a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It is the model of leadership that combines moral clarity with political pragmatism. It is the demonstration that self-education and strength of character can overcome poverty and lack of formal credentials. It is the proof that even in the darkest times, even when the nation tears itself apart, it is possible to believe in and work toward a better future. Most of all, Lincoln's legacy is the reminder that words matter, that ideas have consequences, that moral arguments carefully and patiently made can change the world. Lincoln's power came from his pen and his voice, from his ability to articulate principles in language so clear and compelling that it could unite a fractured nation and inspire future generations. He showed that democracy requires not just institutions and laws, but also the ability to persuade fellow citizens through reason and shared values. The boy who learned to read by firelight in a one-room cabin became the man whose words are carved in marble, whose ideas reshaped a nation, whose life continues to inspire people seeking to make the world more just. That is the measure of Abraham Lincoln. Not that he was perfect, he was not. Not that he achieved everything he set out to do, he did not. But that from limited beginnings, through effort and character, he became someone who mattered, who made a difference, who left the world better than he found it. That is all any of us can hope to do, and it is more than most of us will achieve. On the hill in Springfield where Abraham Lincoln is buried, his tomb bears a simple inscription from his second inaugural address: "With malice toward none, with charity for all." It is a fitting epitaph for a man who spent his life trying to do right as he saw the right, who preserved the Union and freed the enslaved, who led the nation through its darkest hour and died just as light was returning. The tomb receives visitors still, thousands every year, people who come to pay respects to the man who saved America. They leave pennies on his grave, copper coins bearing his image, small tokens of gratitude for a man who gave everything he had, including finally his life, for the idea that all people are created equal and deserve the chance to make of themselves what they can. The sun sets on Oak Ridge Cemetery, casting long shadows across the hill. The city of Springfield spreads below, larger now than Lincoln would recognize, but still bearing his imprint, still telling his story. And in that story, in that remarkable journey from backwoods cabin to the White House, from poverty to power, from obscurity to immortality, we find something essential about America itself, about the possibility of transformation, about the power of ideas married to character, about the stubborn hope that we can be better than we are. Abraham Lincoln was 56 when he died, cut down just as his great work was completing. We are left to wonder what he might have accomplished had he lived, how Reconstruction might have been different, how the freed enslaved might have been protected and empowered, how the nation might have healed under his guidance. But wondering changes nothing. We have what we have, the preserved Union, the destroyed slavery, the words that still ring across the centuries, the example of a life lived with purpose and principle despite overwhelming obstacles. That is Lincoln's gift to us, and it is enough. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Abraham Lincoln, the man who saved the Union and freed the enslaved, who rose from a log cabin to become perhaps the greatest president in American history. His story is a testament to human possibility, to what can be achieved through self-education, moral courage, and unshakable determination. If you enjoyed this biography, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of Lincoln's life most resonates with you? What lessons from his example speak to our own time? Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Sleep well, and may you wake with renewed faith in what determined individuals can accomplish, even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Good night.